Contrary to what some people say, Jesus wasn't a myth made up by the apostles, and this theory isn't even propagated by secular scholars. The atheist scholar and apologist Bart Ehrman, in his book, Did Jesus Exist?, says, despite the enormous range of opinion, there are several points on which virtually all scholars of antiquity agree. Jesus was a Jewish man, known to be a preacher and teacher, who was crucified, a Roman form of execution, in Jerusalem during the reign of the Roman Emperor Tiberius, when Pontius Pilate was the governor of Judea. There are several ancient non-Christian historians and writers, some of whom dislike Jesus and Christians, who attest that Jesus lived, died by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate, and performed supernatural feats. So let's hear what they have to say. A Jewish historian named Flavius Josephus, in his book Antiquities of the Jews, says, at this time there appeared Jesus, a wise man. He was a doer of startling deeds, a teacher of people who received the truth with pleasure, and he gained a following both among many Jews and among many of Greek origin. When Pilate, because of an accusation made by the leading men among us, condemned him to the cross, those who had loved him previously did not cease to do so. And up until this very day, the tribe of Christians, named after him, has not died out. Josephus records that Jesus was a wise teacher who did remarkable deeds, had both Jewish and Gentile disciples, and was crucified under Pontius Pilate. In the Babylonian Talmud, the primary text of Rabbinic Judaism compiled by Rabbi Rav Ashi, says, on the eve of the Passover, Jesus was hanged. For 40 days before the execution took place, a herald went forth and cried, he is going forth to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. Anyone who could say anything in his favor, let him come forward and plead on his behalf. But since nothing was brought forward in his favor, he was hanged on the eve of the Passover. People with contempt for Jesus acknowledged that he lived, performed miracles, which they believed was sorcery to lead Jews astray, and was crucified. Hanging was synonymous with crucifixion, as we see in Acts 5:30 of the Bible, which says, the God of our fathers raised Jesus, whom you killed by hanging him on a tree. A Roman historian named Tacitus, in his Annals, says, consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Tacitus records that Jesus was executed under Pontius Pilate, and that Christians were hated and tortured for what Tacitus claims was their abominations. A religious professor named J.N.D. Anderson commented on Tacitus' writing, saying, it is scarcely fanciful to suggest that, when he adds that a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, he is bearing indirect and unconscious testimony to the conviction of the early church that the Christ who had been crucified had risen from the grave. A Greek writer named Lucian of Samosata, in his book The Passing of Peregrinus, says, the Christians, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. You see, these misguided creatures start with the general conviction that they are immortal for all time, which explains the contempt of death and voluntary self-devotion which are so common among them. And then it was impressed on them by the original lawgiver that they are all brothers from the moment they are converted, and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage, and live after his laws. All this they take quite on faith, with the result that they despise all worldly goods alike, regarding them merely as common property. A Hellenist acknowledges that Jesus existed, was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and was worshipped by Christians, or misguided creatures as he referred to them, who lived modest lives in accordance with the teachings of Jesus. A Roman lawyer and magistrate named Pliny the Younger, in his letter to Emperor Trajan, says, they asserted, however, that the sum and substance of their fault or error had been that they were accustomed to meet on a fixed day, before dawn and sing responsively a hymn to Christ as to a God, and to bind themselves by oath not to some crime, but not to commit fraud, theft, or adultery, not to falsify their trust, nor refuse to return a trust when called upon to do so. When this was over, it was their custom to depart and to dissemble again to partake of food, but ordinary and innocent food. Pliny acknowledges the existence of Jesus and said that Christians strive to live holy lives and sang to Jesus as one would to a god. So he affirmed that the first Christians worshiped Jesus as God. A Greek historian named Phlegon in his 13th book says, "In the 4th year, however, of Olympiad 202, an eclipse of the sun happened, greater and more excellent than any that had happened before it. At the 6th hour, day turned into dark night, so that the stars were seen in the sky, and an earthquake in Bithynia toppled many buildings of the city of Nicaea." This matches up with the New Testament's account, which says, "Now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani, that is, my God, why have you forsaken me? And some of the bystanders, hearing it, said, This man is calling Elijah. And one of them at once ran and took a sponge, filled it with sour wine, and put it on a reed and gave it to him to drink. But the other said, Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him. And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up to his spirit. And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook and the rocks were split." To summarize, both ancient and contemporary scholars and historians attest that Jesus existed, was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and was worshipped by his earliest followers. So we have no reason to doubt the existence, crucifixion, and worship of Jesus as God. And the ancient historians and writers acknowledge that he performed supernatural feats, which secular scholars pass off as legend. The only dispute is whether he is who Christians believe him to be. And that's something you should consider investigating, because if he is who Christians understand him to be, then everything he taught is true. And if everything he taught is true, then there's a God who loves you and offers you eternal life. Please consider sharing this video with someone.